Welcome, and thank you for attending tonight's program, which is part of a series of programming sponsored by the Illinois League of Women Voters Mis- and Disinformation Task Force. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the Illinois League of Women Voters website, along with the previous programs regarding mis- and disinformation. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We have muted all your microphones to avoid distractions during the presentation, but we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have in the chat. Most of you are familiar with using the chat, but for those who are still learning how Zoom functions, you will find the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Just click and type your question. Ann Sullivan, co-chair of the LWVIL Mis- and Disinformation Task Force, will be asking as many of your questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. Now, I'm happy to introduce my friend, Michael Spikes. Michael has spent more than 15 years in the fields of media literacy education, news media literacy, and youth media. Michael most recently has been involved in implementation strategies for incorporating media literacy into existing K-12 curricula for educators in Illinois, in response to Illinois being the first state to implement a media literacy requirement for all high school students. In conjunction with this work, he is the co-founder of the Illinois Media Literacy Coalition and the Illinois State Chapter Leader for Media Literacy Now. His work is recognized by the Illinois State Board of Education as a key resource for media literacy education and by the Illinois News Broadcasters Association as a 2022 recipient of its Illinois of the Year Award. Michael earned his PhD in the Learning Sciences from Northwestern University's School of Education and Social Policy in August 2023. Prior to Northwestern, he previously held roles as a project manager for the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University, a media studies teacher for both public and public charter schools in Washington, D.C., and as a member of the educational advisory team at the News Museum. He has also held roles as a media producer and editor for NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and the Kellogg School of Management. His current research is centered on the practice and pedagogy of media literacy education and news media literacy toward encouraging critical thinking to limit the effects of exposure to mis- and disinformation. Michael, welcome.
So I like to always kind of start things here and mention to you that my own sort of journey through understanding information, education, media, and all of that sort of started in this place some 20 years ago. And this was the elementary school library where I had my first job in education. And it was funny that this was the place that I sort of landed first and this was actually in the district back in Ohio, where I actually went to. This was not my elementary school, but one of them in the district that I was a student in. And what I was told, because folks that knew me when I was in high school knew I was very much into media, music, all of those kind of things, and said, this seems really, really interesting for you, because there was a job posting for a media specialist. And I thought, yeah, this would be really, aligned with me because I'm so into media. And then I found that I was going to be the librarian. But it really, as I sort of think back on it, it really gave me sort of like a great set of training wheels for engaging in lots of the topics that I'm going to be talking with you about today. As you also heard in my introduction, I then took that forward and started teaching media studies and media production classes to high school students in the DC public and public charter schools, and then eventually took that on to then start thinking about media, not only just media production, but also the consumption of media, how we do so through the sort of discipline of media literacy and news media literacy. So in all of these roles that I've sort of held, I've looked to develop and teach interventional strategies for engaging with and learning from media. And all these strategies have become all the more important in these recent times, as our current media ecosystem sort of presents with us a number of challenges that demand on us as audience members to take on a much more thoughtful and a much more skeptical disposition to the sort of flood of content that comes at us every day. So to help others build these skills, I've been working with educators and also in lots of different kinds of learning environments. I would even say, the conversation that we're going to be involved with tonight as one of those learning environments to help us develop these sort of skills to help us become those more skeptical and thoughtful folks when it comes to taking up media. Some of the places that I have taken up these roles have included libraries and also more broadly here in Illinois through the Illinois Media Literacy Coalition. Now, currently, a lot of my research and writing has been focused on actual instances of media literacy and its teaching within classrooms and other learning environments, like I mentioned, just like this one that we're in today. And in that work, I've observed and categorized pedagogy of different types of instructors of media literacy. And these have included people like high school civics teachers, librarians, again, and with young people and also journalists, because in a lot of cases, especially when we start talking about news media literacy or the other term that's used for it, news literacy, many times we think of journalists as the experts in this area, and we ask them to then teach others about what it is they do. And they take very specific steps in bringing this information to audiences. And then, along with that, as I mentioned before, this work has been boosted here in Illinois, in particular, with the recent legislation that now has put in a requirement for a unit of media literacy to be taught to all high school students. And that started in the 2022-23 academic year. And colleagues of mine and I have played key roles in thinking about implementation through the Illinois Media Literacy Coalition, and we've been building awareness around the use of media literacy through talks with various media outlets and ongoing research in those areas. What we've also done in response to this is we penned a framework for media literacy education that we have shared with educators around the state. As you heard Barb talk a little bit about, that framework has been adopted by the State Board of Education as a key resource for teachers to help them understand media literacy. And the way that we sort of did this was we tried to outline a specific definition for media literacy, and that's where I'm going to start here. And that definition that we use is that media literacy, and we're talking broadly, is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and communicate using a variety of objective forms, including but not limited to print, visual, audio, interactive, and digital text. So what that really kind of comes down to is using a collection of skills and knowledge to then interpret, analyze, access, evaluate, and do all these kind of things with media in lots of different forms. But there's a few things that I like to emphasize when we talk about media literacy. One of those is that media literacy is a collection. As you see, there's a number of competencies that's put into this definition that help us to say, here are the particular actions that we think a media literate person would be able to do. So know that, again, media literacy is a collection of both knowledge about media and skills that are informed by that knowledge. And I hope to bring some of that to you tonight, just like I'm giving you the definition here. And then media literacy is not something you only do once. So you might be learning this from me tonight. But I definitely hope that I give you and present this in a way where you can find yourself drawing back to the knowledge and the skills that I'll be bringing to you tonight to help you use this as an ongoing practice that you can exercise in a number of different ways. Yes, there is the part where we need to evaluate and be able to make sense of the information that we see in front of us, but also in today's sort of media ecosystem, we're not only consumers of media, we're also creators of it. We take photos, we take videos, we write posts, and things like that. And we now have the power to share messages broadly with people in lots of different ways. So we definitely see media literacy as something that should be ongoing for us to be those kind of mindful, not only consumers, but also producers. And largely, when media literacy is used, what we see as sort of like the primary goal of it is to give control to the consumers of media, the users of media, to have the agency to choose what media they want to use, how and when to use it, and how to address this impact. So, what we talk about here is how people will respond to different pieces of media. And that's what I'm going to hope to outline to you today. So, the particular way that I like to approach media literacy is through a what I call a subdomain of media literacy that you heard me mention earlier, news media literacy, also known as news literacy. And what it does is it takes the competencies that are part of media literacy and focuses it on journalism and news. I should say, and if you want to get kind of complicated about it, even sometimes news and journalism are not always the same things. We sort of look at news as the product of journalism, but what news literacy looks to do is to both use the practices of journalists who produce news, give you knowledge around that, and then helps you to say, now that you know those skills, hopefully you can take up some of those skills. Then you can evaluate pieces of information that may call themselves news so that you can line them up and say, do the practices that are used to produce this content that's calling itself news, do they line up with the ways that we understand the practices that should be involved in creating news? Now, news literacy in itself, the model that I use, comes out of a course that is taught at Stony Brook University and a number of other institutions around the country and around the world. I've been involved in doing some of that teaching and development of that content. And that starts here with trying to define what is news literacy. So this particular course, it has like 16 different lessons that it uses. I'm going to be presenting one of them to you. So we start off with sort of answering this question of what is news literacy. And in this first sort of lesson, although this is not the one I'm going to be talking with you about, we sort of try to frame news literacy as a part of communications and media broadly. And we tell our students we're going to do a historical sort of review of this that will take us from Gutenberg, the gentleman on the left side of that slide there, all the way up to Zuckerberg. And we say, what are the particular technological changes that came into play when we had things like the printing press, and how do those align with what we see today with the advent of social media? How does that make us think about the kind of content that we see all the time? We then, and the one that I'm going to be talking to you about today, is understanding the different genres of media that we may encounter on a regular basis. How do we distinguish each of these different genres, especially on, again, social media platforms where lots of these genres get essentially flattened altogether because the platforms by which we get a lot of information do not make distinctions between all of these different kinds or genres of media that we may encounter on them. So, how can we figure out for ourselves what those distinctions are? Another lesson that we use in the news literacy, this particular model talks about how do we make distinguishing features from journalistic opinion to straight news, and then assertions that sometimes are shared lots of times online. How do we make distinctions between the two of those things? What is news media bias, and how does it align with audience bias? So one of the things that we use to sort of help us understand what news media bias is we sort of set it in the context of balance and fairness. How do we understand those things? And then we take all of these parts together at the end of the course, and we do sort of active, what we call deconstruction of media. So we take students through, all of these lessons. We show them news stories, and we ask them, here are a series of steps that you can use to really try to determine if what they're seeing is news content. Is it reliable content? Is it credible content? And these come at the end of this particular model. So this gives you sort of like an overview of what the lesson that I'm going to take out of this model sort of all culminates to. So what we sort of start with when talking about, making these distinguishing, becoming these more uh, mindful consumers, creators of media, is we talk a lot about the challenges that are in front of today's consumer of not only news, but all kinds of information. We highlight four in our lessons, but here I'm going to just highlight two of them. that are most pertinent for us today. And that is first, that we're just swimming in so much information and that it's so quickly accessible to us that it becomes very difficult for us to really slow things down and take the time to ask the questions of where did this come from? What is being claimed? How does the person that is bringing this know what they know, and so on? Again, the platform from which we get more and more of our information from are not allowing us to do that, because these days, a lot of times, and I use this with my students, lots of times, as I say, it's not so much that we seek out information, it's that information seeks us out. You think about the number of times that your smartphone, computers, tablets, you know, make certain noises and try to get your attention throughout the day, right? And with that overload of information, it makes it less and less likely that for us as consumers that we will be able to take the time to think deeply about the content that we're seeing. How do we slow down to really ask those kind of questions? And it becomes really difficult for us to focus on one thing for very long. A very apt quote that I like to use in my classes that comes from the sociologist Herbert Simon, who also coined the phrase the attention economy, which some of you might be familiar with, is this: is that he says, what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. So many of us might say, especially among young people, their own attention spans are becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. We could also say that for many of us in this new sort of media ecosystem where so much is vying for our attention, it becomes harder and harder for us to only focus on one thing at a time. Everybody wants to be a multitasker all the time, while not always thinking about the fact that by doing multitasking, it just makes it much more difficult for us to do any one of those tasks very well. So, so how can we, we want to think about this and putting this into the context of the kind of, again, the ecosystem we're living in. The second challenge that also is connected to this that I want to highlight is that much of the content that we get online is what we call disintermediated media. And what that means is the consumer of media is connected directly to the, did I say it right? I'm sorry. The producer of the media is directly connected to the consumer. And this is done in a transactional way where there is no middle person in between that makes a choice about the relevancy, the the accuracy of the content that's coming to us. More times than not, it's just sort of unfiltered. Lots of that, so lots of those things happen. And instead of there being human oversight of the content that we get access to, many more times it's computer algorithms that are making those choices. And those algorithms are making choices based on not if it's credible or not, but more so, does it keep us on sites for longer periods of times? You may have heard of the term engagement, and that being how much time we spend on sites. It wants to, the platforms where we're getting information, Facebook, all these kind of places, they really try to emphasize time on site. So what we see is more stuff that captures more of our attention for longer periods of time. So, what this also does, this sort of idea of the disintermediation, it leads to this sort of, and you see the other part of this, is a blurring of lines between different, you heard me mention genres earlier. I'll also say they could be categories of information. So, on platforms like Instagram, what happens is a lot of the markers that would usually tell us, oh, this is news, this is entertainment, this is an ad, a lot of these markers get flattened. So if you think about, you watch TV, you turn on the television at 5 o'clock, you watch one of the local channels, and usually you'll find that the news is on at that time of day. And the markers that sort of tell you that are not just that you see anchors sitting behind a desk. There's different kinds of images that come up, but it's also the time of day that it comes on, the channel that it's on, and so on. Those kind of markers help us to know this is what I'm looking at. This is how, I may respond to it. But now on these platforms, many of those markers get flagged. And what we get is content like news content, like you see here in this example from Instagram, where you might have a post from the Chicago Tribune that has to sit next to other content that may call itself news or may look kind of like news, but its intent is very different than that of the journalist that created that news. Here's another example of this that I like to use in these workshops. So here are two Facebook posts, and on the left there is a story from NPR that discusses the breeding of a habanero pepper that has all the flavor of the pepper but no heat. And if you're anything like me and don't like spicy foods, you may go, "Oh, that's something that's really interesting to me." And then on the right side, there's another piece of content that if you lived in Orlando, you may say, "Oh, that's also a piece of news because these are people that I see on my local Fox station." You see it's Fox 35 there, and the image there says, "Oh, it's a video." It looks very much like it might be news. But then I invite, the people coming to see me. I say, "Look closer at this place and what do you see?" You see things like the word sponsored at the top of that post. You see a shop now button. You see text that talks about get $30 off your first order. And you go, "Oh, that's not a piece of news. This is actually an ad." But on these platforms, again, while yes, it does say sponsored and so on, in the context we're in right now, like I'm directing you to look for those things. And when you're just sort of scrolling through, you may not pay attention to those things. And it might be very difficult to make distinctions between these two pieces of content. So that leads us to understanding, and this is one of the, I would say this is like the second or third lesson that we usually use in the news literacy course, and that is helping students to make distinctions between all of these different, we can call them categories, we can call them genres of media that we might encounter on these platforms. We take students through all six of these genres, that being journalism, propaganda, raw information, entertainment, advertising, and publicity. For time's sake, I'm not going to have the time to go through every single one, but our main goal here is to give students, and just like everyone here, one of the, I hope the takeaways for you will be, is a set of practices, characteristics that should be attached to something that calls itself news or journalism that all of you and my students could use to make sure that if they come upon something that calls itself news, does it align with those practices? So what we use is something called the taxonomy of information neighborhoods. You'll see a short link there on the screen that you can use if you would like to download a copy of this chart of this taxonomy. And what this taxonomy does is that it breaks down each of these six categories slash genres of media, those being journalism, entertainment, advertising, publicity, propaganda, and raw information, into categories that helps people to understand and define and see the characteristics of it by the intended goal of each of these. Sorry, I'm going back and forth with these. The goal of each of these genres of media, the methods that are used in each of those genres, the practitioners or who are the people who usually create and distribute this kind of content, and what are the intended outcomes of this kind of content. Okay. This idea of information neighborhoods comes from the model that I mentioned from the Center for News Literacy. If some of you might be familiar with another organization that works on news literacy, they're known as the News Literacy Project. They call these info zones. Now, in the talk tonight, what I'm going to focus on is these two areas, the goals of these genres and the intended outcomes. I'll give you a few seconds to take a look at each of those. So when looking at the goals that we have here for each of these genres of media, understanding these goals can help you to understand what the intent of each of these genres are. And some of these might be easy to identify. So, like, say, for instance, that you're watching a clip from the show Saturday Night Live, you most likely would identify it as being entertainment, since its goal is to amuse, entertain, and so on. And that can be made very distinctive from, say, a commercial for a product because its intent, and as you see, its goal is there to sell you something, sell you either on the brand or to sell you a particular product. And you can usually make those distinctions and you know what those both of those things are. It is also argued that when you can identify these different types of intents, purposes, goals of each of these different genres, we sort of as consumers snap into a particular way of thinking. You see an advertisement and you might be thinking to yourself, like, oh, is that something that I need? Is that something that I want to use? Or if you're looking at a piece of journalism, you might ask yourself questions like, how credible is that? Is this information that I can use? If it's say if it's talking about say a political candidate, how good is this information? Is it helping me to make decisions about who I might want to vote for, or who I might want to support, or how others might think about this issue, and so on. And if you think about the ways, again, that your own thinking processes change as you take in that content, it is, again, when you can think about what the intents of that content are, it helps us to understand if those intents line up with our own as consumers. This is why I do see this as really being important. But a lot of times, especially online and on social media, as I mentioned, you heard me mention before, the lines between all of these genres can get really, really blurry. So let's take a look at an example. So I'm going to give you some time to just think about it, but we're going to take a look at a quick video that sort of does this. And usually, what I do when I play this video is I ask people, I want you to be thinking about what genre you think this video fits into, and if it might be multiple genres that it fits into, thinking about the intents and the purposes that we have here. Okay, here we go.
Getting that perfect photo is now more important than ever. Selfie sticks have helped get a better shot, but at the inconvenience of carrying it. At Ms. Moose, we understand the importance of looking great without giving up comfort.
The selfie stick is a great solution to a problem, but in turn, it has created a new problem. This was the opportunity for Ms. Moose to create an even greater solution.
Introducing the selfie shoes. No matter where you go, you'll always be camera ready. Just insert your phone into the port, raise it to the perfect angle, and click the internal button with the tap of your toe to take the photo.
To get the best range of angles, we have also added a docking port on each shoe, so you can get a photo from either your right or your left shoe. The great thing about the selfie shoes is you no longer need to use your arm, so now both hands are free to be in the photo.
We're all super pumped about the selfie shoes. With wearable devices on the horizon, the possibilities are endless. We're working on a charging functionality as well as making the selfie shoes water resistant, so really, we're just getting started.
Sign up to be one of the first to get a pair at msmoose.com/selfieshoes.
All right, the selfie shoe. So, and I know this is going to play again.
Getting that perfect photo.
And mute that. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 30 seconds here. Usually I do this. I tell people, like, turn and talk to your partner and try to identify which of the categories or genres that we have here, or if multiple genres might fit with this, think about which of them you think fits with what you just saw. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that on your own. Okay, couple more seconds. And there. All right. So this is usually when, if I'm looking at the audience, if we was all together, I would ask you to say, I would ask like, well, how many of you thought it was entertainment? People would put their hands up. I would ask, how many people thought it was advertising? Number of people put their hands up. And I would ask around the other ones, and a couple of people, nobody ever says they think it's journalism. Some people might say, well, could it be raw information? Could it be publicity? And so on. But most people identify this as sort of blurring the lines between advertising and entertainment, because you may have looked at, who doesn't like to laugh at selfie culture, right? The woman putting the phone in her shoe and then putting her leg up in the air. And they say, well, but also they think that seems pretty silly, but they could kind of see it maybe being a product that somebody might want. Now, then what I start to do with this piece is I'll say, does anybody know of Ms. Moose? And then some people will say, oh, I know that company. And I'll ask, what does Miss Moose sell? And they'll say, oh, yeah, Miss Moose is a company that sells shoes. I think it still is. I hope it is. At least at the time when I had this video. But then they start to go, oh, well, maybe it is a piece of advertising. And then I tell them that this was a video that was released on YouTube on April 1st. And then people will go, oh, then it kind of comes back to the entertainment, because they'll say, oh, it's April Fool's Day and so on. And what we're sort of looking at here is a video that does, essentially blur those lines. It's more so a piece of publicity. This was not a product that Miss Moose had created to sell, even though in some of my workshops, some people have said, I see something like that, like on eBay or on some, errant website. But really what this was a piece of publicity for the company. It was to up the awareness of people to the brand of Ms. Moose as a company that sells shoes, while also, sort of amusing them. So while, yes, it's somewhat of a silly example, but it helps to sort of, make that point of how lots of these genres of media get blurred online. Now, if we take this into the news sort of column, I ask people, now, what about something like this? So this is the news page on NFL.com. And some people will go, I wonder where this might fit. And some might say, and I would ask, like, is it journalism? It sort of self-identifies itself as news, but it comes directly from the NFL. So how can we help make some distinctions between what this might be? Because again, this is one of those pieces of content that sort of blurs those lines. And this is what helps us to get to a particular definition that we use in the news literacy class to help define news. And we say what news is it is information of some public interest that's shared and subject to a journalistic process of verification, for which an independent individual or organization is directly accountable for that information. And as you see here, I have underlined and in another color is these three words: verification, independence, and accountability. These are three things we want to look for in any piece of content that self-identifies itself as news. We may also want to use this as being applicable to any information we might use to help us make decisions, take actions, or know even to share it responsibly with someone else. So how do we break these down? First, verification. We call verification the process that establishes or confirms truth or accuracy. And journalists have to collect evidence with the goal of providing the most accurate version of any given event. And to do so, they must support the claims made in any story with multiple pieces of evidence. Now, preferably, that evidence should be direct, meaning it's not hearsay, and that evidence should come from a primary source with knowledge on what occurred. So, how can we look for this as consumers? So, here's an example of a story pulled from the New York Times about a doctor who got a lot of attention during 2020 during the COVID pandemic as somebody who collected data for a study that was used to support the belief that drugs like hydrochloroquine were dangerous to patients when used as a treatment for COVID. Now, this study was later retracted when other scientists found out that they were unable to verify the data supplied by Dr. Desai. This. So, in the story, so we have this claim saying that this is this disputed doctor. We see that in the headline, and then we see a little bit more about that in the subhead of the story. When we look further down in the story, it helps us to understand and see the evidence that's used to help support this information, that while this journal debacle has shaken the broader science community, the people who have known Dr. Desai, who is the person in question here, they described him as a man in a hurry, a former whiz kid, and so on. And then we get more information that tells us, how did these journalists get this information? And it says, in interviews with more than a dozen doctors who worked with him during these times, they said he seemed less interested in patient care than in the medical journal he founded and the company branded as a medical publishing business. So we get not only evidence that helps to support the claims being made in this story, we also get a bit of transparency behind how was that information collected. So all of those together help give us those examples of verification. Next, we have independence, which is similar to something I mentioned earlier, which at the publication level means this is the freedom from control or influence of interested parties, coupled with a system of checks and balances to avoid the influence of pre-existing beliefs. So you might think back to the example I showed to you of the news page from NFL.com. Now, we might say that people who work for the NFL would be able to have the best information about what was going on inside the organization. However, we would also say that they lack independence because they are tied to this large organization, and they might be somewhat hesitant to share information that might make the organization look bad. As another example of this lack of independence, there's a story, as you can see, it's kind of old, but a story of a mayor taking on a false identity to write news stories for a news outlet in his area. Again, now, and we have a whole lesson that goes over like evaluating sources, those kind of things. But in this case, we would say, yes, this mayor might be in the position to give you the best information about what's going on in his city, hopefully. But again, because they lack independence, that mayor would be, again, very hesitant to tell you information that might make the city or himself look really bad. So we would say that this person lacks independence. Okay. We have other examples of these kinds of news, quasi-news outlets. Sometimes we might call these, some people even refer to these as pink slime journalistic websites, where again, they take on looking like news, but when you look at them very much closer, they lack independence. They have stories that very much either are all for, say, one side of the aisle or another, or try to emphasize certain kinds of points. And we say they lack independence. And this is becoming even harder in these days where there are more and more communities that are losing local reporters. All right, lastly, we have accountability, and that is being responsible for the information that's shared. So as consumers, we can look for accountability for the information that's being shared with us by looking for things like a byline in a story. So do we know who wrote this story? Here in this example from the Washington Post. Do we also have a dateline that tells us when this story was published? So it allows us to know, okay, this was the best case that we had. This was the best form of the information that was had at that particular point of time. As you can see, like if you were to read this story now, you might say, well, this story is it looks like almost 6, 7 months old. So you might go, I might need to find something newer if I wanted to find out information about this swatting effort that might be happening at schools. If there was a mistake made in the stories, and all stories are written by humans, we make mistakes. Do the publications or the outlets make it clear to readers or watchers or whoever what mistakes were made and then what was done to correct those mistakes? Not just that they just change them and don't tell you. Again, these are really good markers of a place that is accountable for the information they are bringing to you. Again, online, these get really, really hazy because lots of people will either write in pen names or will have usernames that don't correspond with their actual names. So we want to make so those people are not being accountable for that information. And do you have opportunities to talk back to that outlet and say, I think you may have made a mistake, or so on. So when we put all these three things together, we try to use these concepts that of verification, independence, and accountability to help people look for information that calls itself news. Because now on these open platforms, things can self-identify as news as easily as anything else. But it becomes much harder for us as consumers to know whether or not that is credible news that we can use. So when we want to look for that credibility in the information, and I would also apply this to not only just news, but I would also apply this to those pieces of information where, again, it helps us to make decisions. Say, reviews online or Amazon. I used to use some slides on Amazon reviews, right? Do they have these things? Can the information be verified? Is the person accountable? Do I know who's bringing me this information? And are they relatively independent in bringing me their own point of view? All right. So from this particular lesson, some of the things I hope you can take away from this include that information of all kinds can be separated into neighborhoods. That's what I use here. I've also talked about them as categories or also genres based on key characteristics, such as what we use for news. Other forms of media, although I didn't talk about this as much, some forms of media will borrow characteristics of news, creating a blurring of lines between categories. One of the things I probably emphasized here more so this evening was that people can self-identify something as news and sometimes create this sort of blurring of the lines between categories because you might get some information that's verified, but then it's also mixed with, say, some entertainment or things like that, or even things that may try to influence opinions. But news itself should be characterized with the acronym VIA, meaning verification, independence, and accountability. And we want to look for those things for anything that self identifies itself as news. So that ends it for me. If you have, I'm ready to take questions from folks. Please, as you heard earlier, you can write them into the chat. I see that there's a few that are there already. If you want to, you can contact me. If you have other questions too, you can contact me at this information here. There is my email address. You can also read more on my background and some of the other places where I've talked about this content at on my own website. That is also linked or just right here. You can find me at mikespikes.com. And I'm going to stop my share and we'll be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm Ann Sullivan, the other co-chair of the Mis and Disinformation Task Force, and I'm going to be in League of Women Voters fashion, sorting the questions that we're getting and asking them to you so that you don't have to pay attention to the chat.
All right.
The first one that we have is about sources for fact checking. One of our viewers wanted to know if you can recommend any websites that for fact checking purposes.
So I am not so much a person that does endorsing of particular, say, outlets or things like that. Because another question I get a lot of times is like, where should I get my news from? Because you seem to be the person that know. And I'll always say, I could tell you where I get my news from, but that's not my goal. My goal isn't to point people towards any particular place. Um, but to say in any of the places that you are going to that's providing fact checks, be aware of a couple of things. Number one, be aware of something that is known as the illusory truth effect, where when a piece of misinformation gets repeated multiple times, it becomes harder for us as the consumers of that information to dislodge that information. So in some cases, fact checkers almost play a role as a disseminator, a further disseminator of misinformation. This is why it makes it even more important for us to find credible, and I like to use this more so than the word like truthful, but credible sources of information that bring us information where it is clear to us that they follow those characteristics that I just mentioned. They verify the information with evidence. They are independent, and we can say relative independence because total objectivity is a fallacy. We are humans. We all have our points of view, but they're relatively independent. And we can know that, and that they are accountable for that information. Those would be things that I would definitely emphasize using when you look for things like a fact check, or even just to check, say, a claim of something that you have heard. Use those to build your own sort of library of those sources that you find credible.
So be your own fact checker.
Essentially, yeah. But also don't, but I would also, like, I always throw up the red flag when I hear people say, I did my research.
That's true.
Mm,
Okay,
because people can take all kinds of facts and take them in whatever sort of way they want. So that's where, again, I go back to my old VIA standpoint.
great. Okay. Um, Another question is, aren't some reliable news sources affected by the individuals who own them, causing them to kill stories that promote or issues that the owner is opposed to? So,
That is, yeah. So we have seen cases where, particularly for journalistic outlets or even some local news sites, where, say, powerful individuals come in, or organizations such as one that we heard about, especially on the TV news side, has been the Sinclair company that has come in and started to buy up local TV stations. And in some cases, those stations, there are certain stories, scripts that are pushed to them to play, and we have issues there with a lack of independence. In those cases, it is unfortunate, but then we start to lose that piece of independence. If we see that an outlet that is calling itself news is kind of changing itself in ways in that their own coverage seems to skew in a certain direction. And in some cases, yes, that could be brought upon by people who own them. I think it's on us as consumers to say we need to, one, talk back to those outlets and say this is not fair, or this is not the coverage that I've come to expect from this organization, and we need to essentially stop, subscriptions, those kind of things, and try to look for other places to find that information. We are fortunate in a place like Chicago where we have a lot of these sort of like upstarts that are trying to fill the gap that other larger legacy organizations have sort of left by the change in ownership and things like that. So again and again, like the big thing, and I didn't put this on a slide, it has become so much more, there's so much more onus on the consumer to make decisions about where they're getting their information from and how they distinguish if a piece of information is credible or not. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're sort of in the problems that we're in today when it comes to the spread and the impact of mis and disinformation. So I definitely want to emphasize that yes, those things happen in our traditional news outlets, and it does just come back to how important it is for us as consumers to take on a new set of skills so we can find credible pieces of information.
right. Okay, great. Here's an interesting one. A lie told often enough can be believed to be true. How do you evaluate that information?
Well, you heard me talk about the illusory truth effect, right there. I think the key questions you always got to ask yourself are, where did this come from? How does this person know this? And even the person that's bringing it to you, how are they involved with that information? Like, one, how do they know what they know? And how independent is this person that's bringing me that information? Say, for instance, if somebody is making a claim of something being fake news, which is a phrase I hate, you should, if you take away anything, this is what I try to emphasize too. I'd be like, tell people stop using it, because fake news doesn't really mean anything because it's so contextual. A person can make a claim that something is fake news, and it could, yes, it could mean that this is something that somebody made up, true, but it also could be just information I don't like, and I just want to take you off of it, right? So for me, it's a problematic term. With that being the case, again, you got to look for those sources that verification is the biggest thing. Where's the evidence? That's probably the other question I should have put in there. So again, where did this come from? How did this person know this? And where is the evidence? That will help me understand this.
Hmm. Hmm. Uh, okay, next question. I'm just going to read the comment verbatim here. I love this presentation. I think media literacy with a focus on news literacy fits well as a precursor that complements the information literacies competency efforts of librarians in higher education. Am I right? Could you speak to this a bit?
Yeah, very much so. So I definitely see information literacy, which is very much the domain of library workers and librarians, is very much their domain. And I would almost say that information literacy and media literacy, I see these as somewhat of like these large umbrellas from which these other, you heard me mention news literacy as a subdomain of these sort of fall under. So these are very much aligned with the framework for information literacy that comes from I think it's like the American Association for School Librarians, or maybe it's the Academic Librarians, one of them. Because I do a bit of work with the American Library Association, but they're very much aligned. And one of the last things I'll say is that I'm actually right now I'm working on a piece for a journal known as Knowledge Quest, in which I'll hope to be talking about the ways in which librarians need to reassert themselves as the information and sort of like information, not only just specialists, but information experts that could really help us make sense out of the things that we see. So call your librarian, they can help you.
Absolutely. Okay, that was a two-part question. So I'm going to read the second part.
Yeah.
Another question is about satire. Studies show that some people don't know that satire isn't news. Yeah, no kidding. Do you have any comments on this? Okay, yeah.
Funny enough, so here's a tip. When you hear that, my next question is what study? Like who study? But thank you for that. Yes, there are studies that do show that. But you know, one of the things that we are sort of losing, and I think it's a real loss in today's sort of ecosystem, is we're losing the ability to like engage with satire. Because we come upon information, because first of all, everybody on the internet think they're funny and they're not. That's the first thing. But I think when we come towards like true satire, the issue is you have to start from a place where people have a shared set of knowledge. So if you're watching, say, the Daily Show or the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, who very much sort of leans into this satire of current events, people these days, we don't all start from this place of sort of like shared knowledge about things that are going on. And because of that, it makes it much more difficult for people to sort of get the joke, right? So I think this is where it becomes more and more important for us to have that sort of shared space of knowledge, because satire can help us better understand issues that maybe we don't want to pay a lot of attention to, or that we kind of want to sort of shuck off. I would even say, as a person who works in a journalism school and is a big proponent of journalism, satire and I think criticism under the best circumstances, helpful critique, I should say critique, not criticism, but critique of the journalism industry is helpful, because what it does is it helps to sort of, you know, it's sort of like the court jester sometimes is the best, even though I'm very careful in saying it's almost the best truth teller, because people don't take them as seriously, but it helps us to sort of see the things that we don't always want to see. So it definitely, that sort of lack of satire is something that I think is very much a loss in our society these days.
Okay, so we're at 7:28, so I think we're going to wrap it up there. We really, really appreciate all of these tips. I think, the idea that we are our own fact checkers is something that we can all take away from that, and it's something that we can, help other people with too. So we really appreciate you helping us figure out how to do that. And just so everybody knows, this was recorded and we will make it available on our League of Women Voters of Illinois website on the Mis and Disinformation page. Probably it's going to be about a week or so because the person who's going to put it on the website is currently on vacation. Michael also shared his contact information if you have specific questions for him. And I'd also like to invite everyone to join us for our next presentation in our Mis and Disinformation education series, which is going to happen on June 19th at 7 p.m. We're going to have Dr. Gina Masulo from the University of Texas, who will be advising us on how to talk to people who disagree with you politically. She's going to provide tangible takeaways for you to apply in your own life to be more open to other viewpoints without compromising your own values. And you can register for that right now at LWVIL.org. So thank you, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you next month.